The day the Galactic Empire attacked, the Ferengi learned what true power looks like, and it was not what they expected. Scott Robinson, the genetically enhanced human super soldier, stood alone against an army of Imperial troops, his advanced exoskeleton and high-tech weapons, making him a one-man army on the battlefields of Ferenginar. Just hours before, Scott had arrived on the Ferengi homeworld as part of a diplomatic mission from the Galactic Alliance, tasked with fostering trade relations with the profit-driven Ferengi. But the Ferengi viewed Scott with suspicion and distrust from the moment he set foot on their planet. They saw his superhuman abilities as a threat to their way of life, and Vega, the high-ranking Ferengi official assigned to liaise with Scott, made no secret of her disdain for the human soldier's presence. As Scott struggled to navigate the complex social and political landscape of Ferenginar, the sudden attack by the Galactic Empire caught the planet off guard. Imperial warships descended from the sky, unleashing a barrage of laser fire and plasma bombs that laid waste to Ferengi cities and infrastructure. In the chaos of the assault, Scott sprang into action, his genetically enhanced reflexes and tactical training allowing him to single-handedly hold off the initial wave of Imperial ground troops. With ruthless efficiency, Scott tore through the ranks of the Imperial forces, his advanced weapons and exoskeleton making him an unstoppable force on the battlefield. As word of his heroic stand spread, the Ferengi began to rally around the human soldier, seeing him as their best hope for survival against the overwhelming might of the Galactic Empire. But even as the Ferengi's view of Scott began to shift, the super soldier found himself grappling with the weight of his own existence as a living weapon. With the fate of an entire planet hanging in the balance, Scott must find a way to unite the fractured Ferengi factions and mount a desperate defense against the Imperial onslaught, all while coming to terms with the implications of his actions on the galactic stage. As the Imperial onslaught continued, Scott knew that the only way to save Ferenginar was to take the fight to the enemy. He gathered the remaining Ferengi warriors, his voice cutting through the chaos and despair that had gripped the planet. "Listen up," he barked, his genetically enhanced eyes scanning the faces of the assembled Ferengi. "The Empire thinks they've beaten us, but they're wrong. We're going to hit them where it hurts, and we're going to keep hitting them until they realize that messing with Ferenginar was the biggest mistake they ever made." The Ferengi looked at Scott with a mix of awe and trepidation. They had seen him in action, watched as he tore through the Imperial ranks like a force of nature, but they had never seen him like this. A leader, a warrior, a man with a plan. Vega stepped forward, her eyes locked on Scott's. "What do you have in mind?" she asked, her voice steady despite the fear that gnawed at her gut. Scott grinned, a feral expression that sent a shiver down Vega's spine. "We're going to teach you how to fight like humans," he said. "How to use your size and speed to your advantage. How to exploit the weaknesses in their armor. How to hit them where they least expect it." He turned to the rest of the Ferengi, his voice ringing out across the battlefield. "We're going to become the worst nightmare the Empire has ever seen." Over the next few days, Scott put the Ferengi through a grueling training regimen, teaching them the finer points of guerrilla warfare. He showed them how to set traps and ambushes, how to use the terrain to their advantage, how to strike hard and fast and then fade away into the shadows. The Ferengi took to the training with a fervor born of desperation, their natural cunning and adaptability making them quick studies. As the Ferengi honed their skills, Scott led them on a series of daring raids against Imperial outposts and supply lines. They struck like lightning, appearing out of nowhere to wreak havoc on the enemy before disappearing just as quickly. The Empire was caught off guard by the ferocity of the Ferengi resistance, their commanders struggling to adapt to the unconventional tactics of their foes. During one particularly daring raid, Scott and his team managed to infiltrate an Imperial command center, fighting their way through layers of security to reach the heart of the facility. As they combed through the data banks, searching for any information that could give them an edge in the war, they stumbled upon a shocking discovery. The Empire's aggression, it seemed, was being driven by more than just a lust for power and conquest. Behind the scenes, a powerful mega-corporation known as Vortex Industries had been pulling the strings, manipulating the Empire into conflicts that would line the company's pockets with blood money. The CEO of Vortex, a ruthless businessman named Maximilian Blackwood, had been secretly funding the Imperial war machine in exchange for exclusive mining rights on the worlds conquered by the Empire. Scott felt a cold fury settle over him as he read through the files, his genetically enhanced mind processing the information at lightning speed. He knew that defeating the Empire on Ferenginar was only the beginning. If they wanted to bring lasting peace to the galaxy, they would need to expose Vortex's corruption and sever its ties to the Empire. Vega and the rest of the Ferengi were shocked by the extent of Vortex's influence, their eyes widening as Scott laid out the evidence before them. "This changes everything," Vega said, her voice barely above a whisper. "We're not just fighting the Empire anymore. We're fighting a war on two fronts." Scott nodded grimly, his teeth clenched tight. "We'll have to adapt our strategy," he said. "Hit them where it hurts the most, their supply lines, their infrastructure, anything that Vortex has its claws in." He looked around at the assembled Ferengi, his eyes blazing with drive. "It won't be easy, but we'll make them pay for every inch of ground they try to take." Just then, a message came through on the command center's comms. A massive Imperial fleet was en route to Ferenginar, led by the notorious Admiral Zardoc. Scott felt a chill run down his spine at the mention of Zardoc's name. He was known throughout the galaxy for his brutal tactics and unwavering loyalty to the Empire. If he reached Ferenginar with his fleet intact, it could mean the end of the Ferengi resistance. Scott knew what he had to do. He had to lead a series of surgical strikes against Zardoc's fleet, weakening it before it could reach Ferenginar's orbit. It would mean pushing himself to the limits of his abilities, unleashing the full might of his genetically enhanced body and mind. But even as he steeled himself for the battles to come, Scott couldn't shake the feeling that he was becoming something more than human. A living weapon, a symbol of destruction and fear. As he grappled with the implications of his own existence, Scott found himself drawn to Vega, who had become a trusted ally and confidant during their time together on Ferenginar. He knew that he would need her help to navigate the treacherous political landscape of the planet, to forge alliances between the humans and Ferengi that could stand against the combined might of the Empire and Vortex. Together they set out to do the impossible, to turn the tide of a war that threatened to consume the entire galaxy. With each passing day, the stakes grew higher, the battles more desperate. But even as the odds seemed insurmountable, Scott and Vega knew that they could not afford to fail. The fate of Ferenginar and the destiny of the universe rested on their shoulders. Scott's fingers flew across the command center's control panel, his enhanced mind processing the tactical data at lightning speed. "We need to hit their supply lines," he announced, his voice cutting through the tense atmosphere. "It's our best chance to weaken Zardoc's fleet before it reaches Ferenginar." Vega leaned in, her eyes scanning the holographic display. "What's the plan?" "Surgical strikes on their refueling stations and ammo depots," Scott replied, highlighting key targets on the map. "We'll cripple their ability to sustain an offensive." Over the next few days, Scott led a series of daring raids on Imperial supply facilities. His exoskeleton hummed with power as he slipped past security systems, planting explosives and sabotaging critical infrastructure. The Ferengi strike teams followed his lead, their natural cunning complementing Scott's enhanced abilities. During one such mission, Scott infiltrated a heavily guarded refueling station. He had just finished rigging the main fuel tanks to detonate when a voice cut through the darkness. "So you're the one causing all this trouble?" Scott whirled around, his enhanced senses on high alert. A figure stepped out of the shadows, a woman with piercing eyes and an athletic build that spoke of more than human capabilities. "Commander Zora," she introduced herself, her stance shifting into a combat-ready position. "I've been looking forward to meeting you." Without warning, Zora launched herself at Scott. Her speed and strength caught him off guard, and he barely managed to deflect her first strike. They exchanged blows at a furious pace, their enhanced reflexes turning the fight into a blur of motion. Scott felt his ribs crack under a vicious kick, but he countered with a series of rapid punches that sent Zora staggering back. As they fought, Scott realized with growing unease that Zora's abilities matched his own. "How?" he grunted, dodging a roundhouse kick that would have taken his head off. Zora's lips curled into a cold smile. "Vortex Industries sends its regards. You're not the only super soldier in this galaxy, Scott Robinson." The revelation hit Scott like a physical blow. He hesitated for a split second, and Zora capitalized on his distraction, Her fist connected with his jaw, sending him crashing into a bank of computers. Scott tasted blood in his mouth as he struggled to his feet. He knew he couldn't afford to lose this fight. With a roar of effort, he pushed his enhanced body to its limits, unleashing a barrage of strikes that overwhelmed even Zora's formidable defenses. As Zora lay defeated at his feet, she looked up at Scott with a mixture of respect and defiance. "This isn't over," she gasped. "Vortex has an army of us. You can't win." Scott's mind raced with the implications as he triggered the explosives and escaped the crumbling facility. He needed to warn Vega and the others about this new threat. Back on Ferenginar, Vega listened to Scott's report with growing concern. If Vortex has been creating super soldiers for the Empire, who knows how deep their influence goes? She mused. We need to dig deeper. Over the next few weeks, Scott and Vega worked tirelessly to uncover the extent of Blackwood's corruption. Scott's enhanced senses allowed him to spot patterns in financial records and communications that others would have missed. Vega's knowledge of Ferengi politics proved invaluable as they pieced together a web of bribery and coercion that reached into the highest levels of government. As they worked, Scott found himself drawn to Vega's purpose and sharp intellect. She, in turn, began to see past his fearsome reputation as a living weapon, recognizing the man beneath the enhanced exterior. Their investigation was interrupted by urgent news. The Imperial fleet had entered the Ferenginar system. Scott knew they were out of time. They needed a plan to buy more time for the planet's defenses. "We can't match them ship for ship," Scott said, studying the tactical display. "But we can use that against them." He outlined a daring plan to lure a portion of the fleet into a trap, using the Ferengi's knowledge of local space and Scott's tactical expertise to isolate and destroy several capital ships. The gambit worked better than they could have hoped. Using a combination of false sensor readings and hit-and-run attacks, they managed to separate a battle group from the main fleet. The ensuing battle was fierce, but the Ferengi's unconventional tactics and Scott's leadership carried the day. As the last Imperial ship exploded in a brilliant fireball, a transmission cut across all frequencies. The holographic image of a man in an ornate uniform materialized before them, his eyes burning with cold fury. "I am Admiral Zardock," the man announced, his voice dripping with contempt. "You have succeeded only in delaying the inevitable. I will personally oversee the destruction of your pathetic world and the capture of the human abomination you harbor." As the transmission cut off, Scott felt the weight of responsibility settle heavily on his shoulders. He looked around at the Ferengi crew, their faces a mixture of fear and persistence. Then his eyes met Vega's, and he saw in them a strength that bolstered his own dedication. "Zardock's coming for us," Scott said, his voice steady. "So let's make sure we're ready for him." Scott's fingers flew across the tactical display, his enhanced mind processing countless variables as he formulated his plan. "We need to hit them hard and fast," he said, his voice tight with focused intensity. "Cripple their fleet before it reaches Ferenginar." Vega leaned in, her eyes scanning the holographic projections. "How do we do that against such overwhelming numbers?" "Surgical strikes," Scott replied, zooming in on key targets within the Imperial Armada. "We'll take out their vital systems, command structure, anything that will throw them into disarray." Over the next few hours, Scott briefed a team of elite Ferengi operatives, outlining a daring plan to infiltrate Zardock's flagship. As they prepared for the mission, Scott felt the familiar hum of his exoskeleton powering up, his enhanced senses sharpening to a razor's edge. The insertion was textbook perfection. Using stealth technology reverse-engineered from captured Imperial vessels, Scott's team slipped past the flagship's defenses undetected. They moved through the cavernous ship like ghosts, their path cleared by Scott's ability to hack and manipulate the vessel's systems. As they neared the warp core, alarms blared through the corridors. "They've detected us," Scott growled, his muscles tensing for the inevitable confrontation. "Stick to the plan. We finish this." The team split up, with Scott leading a group towards the bridge, while the others headed for the weapons array. The corridors became a battleground as Zardock's personal guard descended upon them. Scott's enhanced reflexes allowed him to dodge blaster fire with inhuman speed, closing the distance to engage in hand-to-hand combat. The clash was brutal and swift. Scott's fist connected with augmented force, shattering armor and bone alike. He moved with fluid grace, each motion precise and devastating. Yet even as he fought, a part of him recoiled at the destruction he was capable of inflicting. Through the chaos of battle, Scott and his team pushed forward. They reached the bridge where Scott interfaced with the ship's mainframe. As he downloaded critical data, his enhanced mind processed the information in real time. What he saw chilled him to the core. "Vortex Industries," he muttered, his eyes widening. "They're not just funding the Empire. They're creating bioweapons, conducting experiments on aliens. This goes deeper than we ever imagined." A massive explosion rocked the ship. The other team had succeeded in sabotaging the warp core and weapons array. Scott knew their window of opportunity was closing fast. "We've got what we need," he shouted over the din of klaxons and failing systems. "Let's move!" As they fought their way back to their extraction point, Scott's mind raced with the implications of what he'd discovered. The threat posed by Vortex Industries was far greater than they had anticipated. They needed to act fast to neutralize this new danger before it was too late. Once safely back on their own ship, Scott wasted no time in coordinating a series of strikes against Vortex's facilities. Using the stolen data, he pinpointed research centers and weapons caches, dispatching teams to destroy them with surgical precision. During one such raid on a Vortex laboratory, Scott encountered unexpected resistance. A figure moved with speed and strength that matched his own, intercepting him before he could reach the facility's core. "I am Kira," the being announced. Its features a disconcerting blend of Ferengi and something other. "Vortex sends its regards." The ensuing battle pushed Scott to his absolute limits. Kira's abilities mirrored his own. Every punch met with an equally powerful counter. They traded blows at a speed that would have been invisible to normal eyes, the very air around them crackling with the force of their impacts. As they fought, Scott's mind raced. The existence of Kira confirmed his worst fears about Vortex's experiments. They weren't just creating weapons, they were engineering a new breed of soldier, one that could rival even his own abilities. The fight raged on, neither combatant able to gain a decisive advantage. Scott felt his enhanced body straining under the relentless assault, pushing past thresholds he didn't know existed. With each exchange, he was acutely aware of the fine line between man and weapon that he walked. In a moment of clarity amidst the fury of battle, Scott's thoughts turned to Vega. He recognized the growing bond between them, a connection that transcended their alliance of necessity. It was this human connection, he realized, that separated him from the soulless weapon Vortex sought to create. Renewed by this revelation, Scott found an extra reserve of strength. In a blindingly fast sequence of strikes, he finally broke through Kira's defenses. As his opponent fell, Scott stood over them, panting heavily. "It doesn't have to be like this," he said, extending a hand. "You're more than what they made you to be." Before Kira could respond, the facility's self-destruct sequence initiated. Scott was forced to retreat, leaving behind unanswered questions and a growing sense of the true scale of the conflict they faced. Back on Ferenginar, Scott briefed Vega and the Resistance leadership on what he'd discovered. The room fell silent as he laid out the full extent of Vortex's activities and the impending threat of Zardok's approaching fleet. "We've dealt them a serious blow," Scott concluded, his voice firm. "But this fight is just the beginning. Zardok is coming, and we need to be ready." Vega's eyes met his, filled with a mixture of concern and something deeper. "What's our next move?" she asked. Scott turned back to the tactical display, his enhanced mind already formulating strategies. "We prepare for the biggest fight of our lives," he said, highlighting key defensive positions around Ferenginar. "And we show the Empire and Vortex Industries that they've picked the wrong planet to mess with." Scott's fingers flew across the holographic display, adjusting the final details of their assault plan. The air in the command center crackled with tension as Ferengi operatives scurried about, relaying orders and coordinating with the fleet. Vega leaned in, her eyes scanning the tactical readouts. "We've got multiple targets across Zardok's armada. If we can take out their command and control systems—" A commotion at the entrance cut her off. Scott whirled, his enhanced senses instantly alert. Two Ferengi guards stumbled in, supporting a battered figure between them. "Kira," Scott breathed, recognizing the genetically engineered soldier he'd fought at the Vortex facility. Kira's eyes locked onto Scott's, filled with urgency. "We have a problem," she gasped, clutching her side. "Blackwood, he's rigged the Imperial ships with thermonuclear warheads. If the invasion fails, he'll level Ferenginar." The room erupted into chaos. Scott's mind raced, processing this new threat. He turned to Vega, seeing his own dogged drive mirrored in her eyes. "We need to shift our focus," Scott said, his voice cutting through the panic. "A small team, infiltrate Zardok's flagship, disable those warheads." Vega nodded, already pulling up schematics of the Imperial vessel. "We'll need to move fast. Our intel suggests—" A proximity alarm blared, drowning out her words. Scott's enhanced vision zoomed in on the tactical display, identifying a new threat. "Imperial remnant ships," he growled. "Zardok's called in reinforcements." The next hours passed in a blur of frantic preparation. Scott assembled his strike team, Vega, Kira, and a handful of elite Ferengi warriors. As they boarded their stealth shuttle, Scott felt the familiar rush of pre-mission adrenaline, his body humming with readiness. Their insertion was textbook, slipping past the Imperial defenses like ghosts. Inside the massive flagship, they moved with practiced efficiency, neutralizing patrols and sabotaging systems. As they approached the ship's core, the resistance stiffened. A familiar figure stepped out of the shadows, flanked by a squad of heavily armed soldiers. "Commander Zora," Scott said, his muscles tensing for combat. "I had a feeling we'd meet again." Zora's eyes gleamed with anticipation. "This time, I'll finish what I started." The corridor erupted into a maelstrom of blaster fire and hand-to-hand combat. Scott's enhanced reflexes allowed him to dodge and weave through the chaos, closing the distance to Zora. Their clash was a blur of superhuman speed and strength, fists and feet connected with bone-shattering force. Scott felt his body pushed to its limits, every enhanced nerve and muscle stretched to the breaking point. Through the haze of combat, he caught glimpses of Vega and Kira fighting their way deeper into the ship. Good. They could handle the warheads while he kept Zora occupied. Scott ducked under a vicious roundhouse kick, countering with a flurry of strikes that drove Zora back. He pressed his advantage, unleashing a barrage of blows that overwhelmed even her formidable defenses. With a final devastating punch, Scott sent Zora crashing into a bulkhead. She slumped to the ground unconscious. Panting heavily, Scott turned towards the ship's core. He needed to catch up with Vega and Kira, ensure the mission's success. As he raced through the corridors, a cold dread settled in his stomach. Something wasn't right. The opposition they'd faced, it had been too easy. Scott burst into the core room, his enhanced senses instantly taking in the scene. Vega lay crumpled against a far wall, clearly stunned. And there stood Kira, her hands flying across a control panel, a triumphant smile on her face. "I'm sorry, Scott," Kira said, not looking up from her work. "But Blackwood's vision, it's the only way forward. A new galactic order, built on the ashes of the old." Scott's mind reeled. He'd been played, used as a pawn to gain access to the very heart of the Imperial fleet. And now, with Kira's fingers dancing across the controls, the fate of an entire planet hung in the balance. He took a step forward, his enhanced body coiling like a spring. "Step away from the console, Kira. You don't want to do this." Kira's eyes met his, filled with a fanatic gleam. "Oh, but I do, and you're the only one who can stop me." With that, she launched herself at Scott, her own enhanced abilities on full display. As they clashed in a titanic battle of genetically engineered super soldiers, Scott felt a familiar darkness rising within him. The urge to unleash his full, lethal potential was overwhelming. But as Kira's fist connected with his jaw, sending him staggering, Scott caught sight of Vega stirring on the floor. In that moment, he realized the true stakes of this fight. It wasn't just about stopping Kira or saving Ferenginar. It was about holding on to his humanity in the face of impossible odds. With renewed focus, Scott squared off against his opponent, knowing that the next few moments would determine not just the fate of a planet, but the very essence of who he was. Time seemed to slow as Scott made his decision. With a guttural roar that echoed through the core room, He unleashed the full extent of his enhanced abilities. His body moved with inhuman speed and precision, each strike a blur of devastating force. Kira's eyes widened in shock as Scott effortlessly parried her attacks, his movements fluid and relentless. In a series of blindingly fast maneuvers, Scott disarmed her, twisting her arm behind her back and forcing her to her knees. Vega stumbled to her feet, her eyes meeting Scott's. The raw power emanating from him was palpable, sending shivers through the air. The Imperial soldiers who had rushed into the room froze, their weapons wavering as they witnessed the superhuman display before them. "Secure the warheads," Scott commanded, his voice carrying an undercurrent of barely restrained energy. Vega nodded, moving swiftly to the control panel. As Vega worked, Scott coordinated with the Ferengi resistance through his neural link. Within minutes, teams swarmed the flagship, neutralizing threats and disabling the Doomsday protocols. The immediate danger to Ferenginar had been averted, but Scott's enhanced senses detected a new threat looming. "Admiral Zardok's reinforcements are closing in," he announced, his mind already formulating a strategy. "We need to move. Now." Leading the charge, Scott guided the resistance fighters through the labyrinthine corridors of the Imperial flagship. They fought their way to the hangar bay, commandeering shuttles and fighters. As they escaped into Ferenginar's atmosphere, the sky lit up with the fire of Zardok's renewed offensive. Scott's voice crackled over the comm channels. "Follow me to the southern quadrant. We'll use the terraforming structures for cover." The alien landscape of Ferenginar stretched out below them, a maze of towering, half-formed structures and deep crevasses. Scott led the resistance forces in a series of daring maneuvers, using the unique terrain to their advantage. Imperial ships crashed into unfinished spires, while Ferengi fighters struck from hidden recesses in the rock. Despite their tactical advantage, the sheer number of Imperial forces began to take its toll. Resistance ships fell from the sky, their destruction marked by plumes of smoke and fire. Scott gritted his teeth, watching his tactical display as their forces dwindled. A new threat appeared on his sensors. A sleek black ship cut through the chaos, flanked by a squadron of equally deadly fighters. Commander Zora's voice filled the airwaves, cold and confident. "Did you really think you could escape us, Scott?" she taunted. "It's time to end this little rebellion." Scott's hands tightened on his controls as Zora's enhanced soldiers engaged the resistance. The aerial battle became a blur of impossible maneuvers and lightning-fast reflexes. Scott pushed his ship to its limits, outflying opponents with moves that defied physics. A lucky shot clipped his wing, sending his fighter into a tailspin. Scott ejected, using his enhanced strength to guide his fall towards a nearby plateau. He landed hard, rolling to absorb the impact. As he rose to his feet, he found himself face to face with Commander Zora. "Just you and me now," she said, her eyes gleaming with anticipation. Their battle was a testament to the limits of human enhancement. They moved faster than the eye could follow, trading blows that would have shattered normal bones. Scott felt his body straining, pushed beyond even his augmented endurance. A vicious strike from Zora sent Scott stumbling back, blood trickling from a gash above his eye. He wiped it away, his enhanced vision picking up a new threat approaching from the north. A massive dropship descended from the clouds, emblazoned with the logo of Vortex Industries. As it touched down, a figure emerged, flanked by heavily armed mercenaries. "Blackwood," Scott growled, recognizing the corporate mogul. Maximilian Blackwood's voice boomed across the battlefield, amplified by unseen speakers. "Gentlemen, ladies, esteemed warriors of the Empire and the Resistance, I believe it's time we discuss terms." Scott tensed, ready for action, but Blackwood raised a hand. Now, there's no need for further violence. After all, I hold all the cards." With a smug smile, Blackwood activated a holographic display, showing the full might of his private army descending on Ferenginar. "You see, while you've been busy fighting each other, I've been positioning my forces to take control of this planet and its valuable resources." Scott's mind raced, calculating odds and potential strategies. He glanced at Vega, who had landed nearby, reading the purpose in her eyes. They had come too far to give up now, but the odds seemed insurmountable. Blackwood's voice cut through Scott's thoughts. So what will it be? Surrender and accept my generous terms? Or shall we see how you fare against the combined might of my forces and what remains of the Imperial fleet? Scott stood tall, his enhanced body coiled and ready for action despite his injuries. The fate of Ferenginar hung in the balance, and he knew that his next decision would shape the future of the entire sector. Scott's eyes narrowed as he assessed the situation. Blackwood's smug confidence, the looming threat of his corporate army, the battered resistance forces, it all coalesced into a single crystal-clear moment of decision. "We don't surrender," Scott growled, his voice carrying across the battlefield. "We fight." Vega stepped forward, her determined gaze matching Scott's own. She keyed her comm unit, broadcasting to all resistance channels. "This is Commander Vega. All units, engage Blackwood's forces. I repeat, engage with everything you've got." The plateau erupted into chaos. Resistance fighters emerged from hidden positions, their weapons blazing. The remaining Galactic Alliance ships dove from the clouds, strafing Blackwood's dropships with laser fire. Scott launched himself at Blackwood, but a blur of motion intercepted him. A massive figure materialized between them. Silas, Blackwood's augmented enforcer. "You'll have to go through me first," Silas rumbled, his augmented muscles rippling beneath his combat suit. Their clash was titanic. Scott's fist connected with Silas's jaw, the impact sending shockwaves through the air. Silas countered with a kick that cratered the ground where Scott had stood a millisecond before. They moved at impossible speeds, their enhanced reflexes and strength on full display. Scott felt his body pushed to its absolute limits, every cell screaming as he traded blows with the behemoth. A vicious uppercut sent Scott flying, his body carving a furrow in the rocky ground. He rolled to his feet, spitting blood. Silas charged, but Scott was ready. He sidestepped, using the enforcer's momentum against him. In a fluid motion, Scott grappled Silas's arm, twisting it with superhuman force. The crack of breaking bone echoed across the battlefield. Silas roared in pain and fury, but Scott pressed his advantage. A flurry of strikes to vulnerable points, solar plexus, throat, temples, and Silas went down hard. Scott stood over his fallen opponent, chest heaving. The victory had come at a cost. His ribs were cracked, internal injuries making every breath agony, but there was no time to recover. A deafening hum filled the air, drowning out the sounds of battle. Scott's enhanced vision zoomed in on a massive structure rising from Blackwood's command ship, the XT-47 disruptor cannon. "Scott!" Vega's voice crackled over his comm. "That cannon will obliterate everything. I'm going in to sabotage it." "Negative," Scott began, but Vega cut him off. "There's no time to argue. I'm the only one who can get close enough. You've got bigger problems incoming." As if on cue, a wall of Imperial fighters screamed overhead. Admiral Zardok's voice boomed across the battlefield. "This ends now, rebels!" Scott watched helplessly as Vega's fighters streaked towards the disruptor cannon. He wanted to follow to protect her, but Zardok's forces were bearing down on the Resistance's position. If they broke through, it was all over. Gritting his teeth against the pain of his injuries, Scott charged towards the Imperial line. He moved like a force of nature, each strike taking down enemy soldiers with brutal efficiency. But for every foe he felled, two more took their place. A familiar figure pushed through the Imperial ranks, Admiral Zardok himself, clad in powered armor that rivaled Scott's own enhancements. "I've waited a long time for this," Zardok snarled, raising a massive energy weapon. The air between them erupted in a maelstrom of energy blasts and hyper-accelerated punches. Scott's injuries slowed him, allowing Zardok to press his advantage. A point-blank blast sent Scott flying, his armor smoking and sparking. As he struggled to rise, Scott's enhanced hearing picked up Vega's voice, barely audible over the comm static. "Scott, I'm in, but they've got me cornered. Blackwood, he's going to—" The transmission cut off. Scott's blood ran cold. Without a second thought, he disengaged from Zardok, ignoring the Admiral's taunts as he sprinted towards Blackwood's command center. Alarms blared as Scott tore through the facility's defenses. Guards fell before him like wheat before a scythe, but with each passing second, His injuries took their toll. By the time he reached the central chamber, his vision swam with pain and exhaustion. The doors hissed open, revealing a nightmarish scene. Vega hung suspended in an energy field, her face contorted in agony. And there stood Blackwood, encased in a hulking exosuit dripping with weapons. "Ah, Scott!" Blackwood's amplified voice dripped with condescension. "Just in time to watch your precious resistance crumble." Scott's muscles tensed, ready to spring into action, but as he faced off against Blackwood, he knew this would be the fight of his life, and the fate of Ferenginar hung in the balance. Scott lunged at Blackwood, his fist connecting with the exosuit's chest plate. The impact sent shockwaves through the air, but Blackwood barely flinched. Instead, he retaliated with a thunderous backhand that sent Scott crashing through a nearby wall. "Is that all you've got?" Blackwood's amplified voice mocked as Scott struggled to his feet. Spitting blood, Scott charged again. The two titans clashed in a fury of superhuman strikes, each blow powerful enough to level buildings. Windows shattered for blocks around as their battle raged across the cityscape. Despite his enhanced abilities, Scott found himself outmatched. Blackwood's exosuit augmented his strength and speed to levels that even Scott's augmented body struggled to match. A vicious uppercut from Blackwood sent Scott sailing through the air, crashing into a skyscraper's facade. As he peeled himself from the crumbling concrete, Scott's enhanced vision caught sight of a familiar device on Blackwood's suit, an electromagnetic field generator. A plan formed in his mind. Scott led Blackwood on a chase through the city, dodging energy blasts and retaliating with precise strikes to keep the corporate mogul's attention. He weaved between buildings, leading Blackwood to a power substation on the outskirts of the city center. "Nowhere left to run, Scott," Blackwood sneered, cornering the super soldier against a massive transformer. Scott's lips curled into a grim smile. "Who's running?" In a blur of motion, Scott ripped the transformer from its moorings, electricity arcing wildly. Before Blackwood could react, Scott slammed the sparking machinery into the exosuit's chest. The electromagnetic pulse ripped through Blackwood's systems. His suit seized up, servos whining in protest. Scott pressed his advantage, raining down blows on the immobilized exosuit. For a moment, victory seemed within reach. Then Blackwood's hand shot out faster than Scott thought possible and latched onto his head. "Nice try," Blackwood growled, "but I always have a backup plan." Searing pain exploded through Scott's skull. His enhanced senses went haywire, vision blurring and limbs spasming uncontrollably. He collapsed, body twitching as Blackwood loomed over him. "Neural disruptor," Blackwood explained, his voice dripping with satisfaction. "Designed specifically for you, my dear super soldier." Through the haze of agony, Scott saw Vega being dragged to a makeshift stage. Blackwood's amplified voice boomed across the battlefield. "People of Ferenginar, witness the price of defiance." Scott strained against the paralyzing effect of the neural disruptor, but his body refused to respond. He could only watch in horror as Vega was forced to her knees, a squad of Blackwood's elite guards taking aim. Just as all seemed lost, a blur of motion streaked across the stage. The guards fell in rapid succession, their weapons clattering to the ground. Standing over their unconscious forms was Kira, her eyes blazing with dedication. "Traitor!" Blackwood roared, but Kira ignored him, freeing Vega from her restraints. The unexpected rescue galvanized the Ferengi resistance. With a mighty war cry, they surged forward, overwhelming Blackwood's mercenaries through sheer numbers and drive. Amid the chaos, Vega fought her way to Scott's side. Her fingers flew over the control module on Blackwood's suit, deactivating the neural disruptor. The paralyzing pain receded, and Scott rose to his feet, muscles tensed for the final confrontation. Blackwood, his forces crumbling around him, faced Scott with a snarl of defiance. "This isn't over." Scott's eyes narrowed as he advanced. "You're right. It's just beginning." The two combatants charged at each other, the fate of Ferenginar hanging in the balance as their final battle commenced. Scott's fist connected with Blackwood's jaw, sending the corporate mogul sprawling. The exosuit sparked and sputtered, its systems finally overwhelmed. As Blackwood slumped to the ground unconscious, a deafening cheer erupted from the assembled Ferengi resistance fighters. Vega rushed to Scott's side, her eyes scanning his battered form. "We did it," she breathed, disbelief and elation warring in her voice. Scott nodded, his enhanced senses already picking up the sounds of celebration spreading across the city. But beneath the jubilation, he detected undercurrents of tension and uncertainty. Days turned into weeks as Ferenginar struggled to rebuild. Scott found himself thrust into a political maelstrom he was ill-equipped to navigate. The newly appointed Grand Nagus, Zek, summoned Scott and Vega to a council meeting in the towering Hall of Commerce. "While we appreciate your assistance," Zek began, his tone carefully neutral, "the council has concerns about your continued presence on Ferenginar." Scott's muscles tensed, sensing the hostility radiating from several council members. Vega stepped forward, her voice firm. "Scott risked everything to liberate your planet. He's not a threat, he's an ally." "An ally?" scoffed a portly Ferengi counselor. "He's a living weapon. How can we trust that he won't turn against us?" The chamber erupted into heated debate. Scott remained silent, his enhanced hearing picking up whispered conversations and backdoor deals being made in real time. A commotion at the chamber's entrance drew everyone's attention. Kira strode in, her Ferengi features set in tenacity. "I pledge my loyalty to Scott," she announced, her voice ringing through the hall. "He showed me the truth about Blackwood's lies. He gave me a chance at redemption." Murmurs rippled through the assembly. Some hailed Kira as a hero, while others hurled accusations of treachery. The political divide deepened before Scott's eyes. As the arguments raged, Scott's comm link chirped. A coded message from his network of informants flashed across his retinal display. Imperial ships were gathering at the edge of Ferengi space. Zardoc had escaped and was rallying his forces for a counterattack. Scott's mind raced, formulating strategies and contingencies. He stepped forward, silencing the chamber with his presence. "We don't have time for this," he growled. "Zardoc is planning an attack. We need to strike first, hit them before they can fully mobilize." Zek's eyes narrowed. "Absolutely not. We won't authorize any offensive actions that could escalate this conflict further." Scott's expression resolute, frustration building. He locked eyes with Kira, a silent understanding passing between them. They would act with or without the council's blessing. As the meeting adjourned, Vega pulled Scott aside, her expression grave. "I've uncovered something," she whispered. "There's a group within the government working against us. They're afraid of change, of losing their power. They'll do anything to undermine you." Scott processed this new information, the pieces falling into place. He faced a war on two fronts, external threats and internal sabotage. As he strode from the Hall of Commerce, his enhanced body coiled and ready for action, Scott knew his next moves would shape not only Ferenginar's future, but his own place in this fragile new world. Scott's enhanced hearing picked up the sound of approaching footsteps. He turned to see Kira striding towards him, her face set with drive. "We can't wait for the council's approval," she said in a low voice. "Zardoc's forces are mobilizing as we speak." Scott nodded, his mind already formulating a plan. "Gather a small team. We move out in 30 minutes. As Kira hurried away, Vega approached, her expression grave. "Scott, be careful. There are forces within the government working against us. They'll use any excuse to discredit you." "Then we'll just have to succeed," Scott replied, his voice resolute. 30 minutes later, Scott, Kira, and a handful of loyal Ferengi warriors boarded a stealth shuttle. As they broke atmosphere, Scott's enhanced vision picked out the telltale signs of Imperial ships gathering at the edge of Ferengi space. The infiltration of Zardoc's base went smoother than expected. Scott moved like a force of nature, his augmented body tearing through security systems and enemy soldiers with equal ease. Alarms blared as they penetrated deeper into the facility. "Scott!" Kira's voice crackled over the comm. "We've got a problem. They're arming some kind of superweapon." Before Scott could respond, Admiral Zardoc's voice boomed through the base's speakers. "Attention, rebel scum! You have 60 seconds to surrender before I unleash this antimatter warhead on your precious Ferenginar." Scott's blood ran cold. He sprinted towards the launch bay, his enhanced body pushing past its limits. As he burst through the doors, he saw Zardoc standing beside a massive missile, his hand hovering over the launch controls. "Too late, Scott," Zardoc sneered. "You've lost." Time seemed to slow as Scott assessed his options. He could take down Zardoc, end the Imperial threat once and for all. But the warhead was already armed, its countdown ticking away. With a roar of frustration, Scott launched himself at the missile. His fingers flew over the guidance systems, rerouting its trajectory into deep space. The silo doors opened with a thunderous groan. "No!" Zardoc bellowed, lunging for the controls. Scott turned to face him, but in that moment of distraction, the missile launched. The antimatter drive ignited, bathing the launch bay in searing light. Scott felt the heat wash over him, his augmented body screaming in protest as the radiation tore through his cells. As darkness claimed him, Scott's last thought was of Ferenginar, hoping he had done enough to save it. He drifted in and out of consciousness, catching glimpses of frantic activity around him. Kira's face etched with worry, the whine of a shuttle's engines, Vega's voice fierce and determined, ordering a medical team to prepare for their arrival. Scott's eyes fluttered open, his enhanced senses immediately assaulted by the sterile smell of a medical bay. Every inch of his body ached, the pain a constant reminder of his brush with annihilation. "He's awake," Vega's voice came from nearby, tinged with relief and something else, an emotion Scott couldn't quite place. As his vision cleared, Scott saw Grand Nagus Zek standing at the foot of his bed, flanked by members of the Ferengi Council. Their expressions were a mix of awe and apprehension. "Scott," Zek began, his tone uncharacteristically humble, "we owe you a great debt. Your actions saved millions of lives." Scott tried to speak, but his throat was raw. Vega pressed a glass of water to his lips, her touch gentle. "We would like to offer you a permanent place here on Ferenginar," Zek continued. "Your skills and wisdom would be invaluable in shaping our planet's future." The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Scott closed his eyes, memories of the battle flashing through his mind, the lives he had taken, the destruction he had wrought. Even in service of a greater good, the weight of it all pressed down on him. I can't," Scott managed to rasp out. Vega's hand tightened on his, her eyes wide with surprise and a hint of sadness. "Scott, what do you mean?" He met her gaze, seeing the unspoken feelings there. It made what he had to say even harder. "I need to go back to Earth," Scott said, his voice growing stronger. "I need time to process everything that's happened." The room fell silent, the implications of his decision sinking in. Kira stepped forward, her expression a mixture of understanding and disappointment. "You've done more for us than we could ever repay," she said softly. "If this is what you need, we'll respect your choice." As the council members filed out, leaving Scott alone with Vega and Kira, the weight of his decision settled over them. The future stretched out before them, uncertain and fraught with challenges. But for now, all Scott could focus on was the long journey of recovery ahead, both physical and emotional. And
you have reached the end of the story. If you enjoyed this story and want to support us, please leave a like and subscribe to our channel. And for every comment that says 88, I will heart every single one of them. Thank you for your time.